fortunate to have Sergeant, United States Army, World War II, Jim Van Schaack to recount his memories while serving. Jim Van Schaack joined the United States Army in 1946. After completing his basic training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, he was assigned to the First Calvary Division and left for Japan to join the U.S. occupation forces in Tokyo. His unit worked under General MacArthur's command to demilitarize and rebuild Japan. Sergeant Van Schaack was sent to the 8th Army Special Services. Jim Van Schaack received the World War II Victory Medal and the Army of Occupation Medal, Japan. In 2019, he was chosen as Veteran of the Year, presented to him by the Honorable William P. Breaux, California Assemblyman, 73rd District, with a California Legislature Assembly resolution. Today, Jim Van Schaack is presenting a video that he produced on the 1945 to 1952 occupation of Japan and the Tokyo War Crimes trials. Please welcome Jim Van Schaack.
What happened on December 7th is important because it literally carries through. MacArthur was a terribly important part of all of this. He was a guy literally that changed Japan. There are people who like MacArthur and there are people who don't like him, but what he did was something nobody else has ever done. All of those places in a little triangle were places literally where they had troops or they occupied or they had control of the government. Some of it was controlled by Japan, the pink, but the other was actually occupied. And as a result, there was nothing left. Australia and the south part of New Guinea and a couple of other small islands, and that was it. They pretty much had everything. And then everything turned around and went the other way. But it took us about 3 years to turn it around. That General MacArthur was the supreme commander of the troops in the Pacific. This guy, he was a terribly important guy in terms of who was doing what during the war. He was the guy that invaded the Philippines, which was our property, not China, not Burma, not India, but our property. And he's the guy we ultimately tried there and executed. The last sea battle of any consequence was the Battle of Leyte Gulf. So while these guys are going north and the Japanese are trying to reinforce themselves coming south, then the sea battle started. So they are all concurrent. Kamikaze was an important part. That's where most of their destruction came as far as our ships were concerned. The battle damage mainly was from them. I think that's the Princeton. It was our small carrier, and it was sunk. But they didn't get any of the really important. That's the largest ship in the Japanese Navy, and it was dumped. It was a kamikaze. Now this is where it really got rough. And there were Filipino civilians that were fighting along with our guys. And as I said, the general tried to get his guys to leave, but there were about 20,000. They were like Marines, Japanese Marines, and they refused to leave. And as a result, they came in and destroyed the city. Now that's hand-to-hand stuff. Here's some of the destruction. We literally set off bombs, burned everything that they couldn't blow up. It was pretty tough. I missed all of this by a year. It was, thank God. But the city was actually a beautiful city. They just absolutely destroyed it. This was an interesting thing. They had an island which is very, very small, but highly fortified. And they had no idea that we could land airborne troops on there, but we did. And that's what this is. There were thousands and thousands of prisoners because most all of our people were still there that were part of MacArthur's entourage, and as a result, they were going to kill them, so we knew we had to get there in a hurry, and it was a real rush type of thing to get up there before they killed them all. Well, they had 2 more bases to take. They had to get places to fly airplanes from. That's why Iwo Jima was this tiny little island and lost a lot of people there. But it was key to bombing. They had an internal battle. When Hirohito said he wanted to capitulate, a group of his generals decided they weren't going to let him. They had a battle inside in his home, and they tried to find a tape not a tape, but a recording that he made that was to go out on the air to the public. And a lot of people got killed. And the ones that didn't get killed themselves, the guys who tried to overthrow Hirohito. So that was a major deal. There's Halsey, there's Nimitz. Both of them are standing there.
The grand climax of 3.5 years of grueling fighting is reached as members of America's historic 7th Regiment of the First Calvary Division enter Tokyo. And General Chase congratulates Private Davis, 1st GI in the Jap capital. With the precision of a well-oiled machine, the occupation rolls into the city. The children have, at least, been taught the correct signals. No chances are taken, however. Full battle equipment is the order of the day. Appropriately, the regiment which fought under Custer adds luster to its record in this historic moment. The hour for which all America waited and prayed approaches as General MacArthur's car enters the American embassy ground, and the Allied commander is greeted by General Chase. Signal Corps and newsreel cameras record the impressive but simple ceremony by which the United States becomes undisputed master of a ruthless foe. In General MacArthur's words, this is the payoff. Pearl Harbor is avenged.
The emperor came out into the public. It was the first time he'd done that. The Japanese people, when he drove down the street, had to either turn their back or put their head on the ground, not to look at him. He was that kind of person. MacArthur, of course, knew that, but he also knew that he had to humanize him, and he did. And that was part of that photograph. It was the first time he'd ever been photographed with anybody like that, and nobody touched him. They went in and warned him, MacArthur, that the emperor doesn't want to shake your hand, won't shake your hand. And that's the very first thing he did. He put his hand out, and the emperor looked at his hand and he put it out and shook it. Well, that's what made him human, literally. From that point on, You see a lot of guys in uniforms. They're the only clothes they had. We just made them take all the insignias and stuff off, and they wore them until they could get clothes. A lot of them were still wearing them when I left there. But they had to come from all those countries you saw in the beginning. Oh, they were everywhere. Some of them didn't know the war was over, literally. She broadcast to the troops. We had radios, and she broadcast to us, and did a lot of harm, a lot of damage to people. They were spies. They had spies out, and they'd give her information. They'd talk about people and units that we had opposing them, and they knew the names of people. It was just I guess, psychological warfare. A lot of this stuff was so antique-y, but there had thousands. I mean, they've been building this thing for 30 years. And they had tons and tons of stuff, but the equipment was pretty bad. But there was lots of it. If they weren't broken up or blown up, they were dumped in the ocean. Everybody, all the Japanese all had swords. I never saw so many swords in my life. We had bunkers full of swords. It was, even the pilots that flew on their Navy ships had swords. They'd wear them in the, in the plane. How they did it, I don't know. The big ships, they scuttled. Submarines, they blew up the little ones or tore them up. But in this one place, there were 70 or 80 submarines. Well, that's what they did, is to make scrap metal out of them. Airplanes, they dismantled a lot of them and they used the parts for other things. They had about 8,000 aircraft that were left. This was a major thing, too. A lot of the Japanese had taken money from other people and put it in their banks. Well, that all had to be straightened out. So the banks were all closed, and about every 4 or 5 months we had to change our money. We printed our own occupation money. But when the Japanese got it and started spending it, then we'd change it so they couldn't do that. Those are zeros that they were assembling. And these awful, tanks are really not very, very good, but they had lots of them. Then for one reason or another, we had parades. I was in one of them. It was winter time, and we had our overcoats on. We had a march for 7 miles. That was a circuit from our place all the way through the city and then back. But we paraded on the Imperial Palace grounds. That's where this is. Oh, actually, when I first got there, they were warning us that Korea was the next place. and we started training for the Korean War. That's what these scenes are. So that all took place in Japan, that training. Along with everything else that we did that too. That's me with a cigarette in my mouth. It's an 81 millimeter mortar. There's Mount Fuji in the background. These were I practice training in the mountains.
Between the 1930s and 1940s, Japan sends troops to the Chinese mainland, across Southeast Asia and into the Pacific Islands, to engage in warfare that ultimately leaves tens of millions of people dead. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan signs the Instrument of Surrender to end the war. The Allied powers appoint General Douglas MacArthur as Supreme Commander and quickly occupy all of Japan. Former Japanese cabinet ministers and military leaders are arrested. In November of the same year, leaders from Nazi Germany, Japan's ally in the war, go on trial in Nuremberg. In January 1946, using Nuremberg as a reference, Supreme Commander MacArthur enacts a charter for the Tokyo trial that outlines 3 categories of war crimes. These are crimes against peace, conventional war crimes, and crimes against humanity. 28 former Japanese leaders are then charged as Class A war criminals. The Tokyo trial begins.
My dearest Lise, it was a long journey from the Netherlands to Tokyo, but I'm safe and settled into the magnificent Imperial Hotel. It's a miracle the hotel is even standing. From here to Yokohama, there's nothing much left but ashes and ruins. The hardships faced by the people here are almost unimaginable. Soon we will begin the difficult task of searching out justice amid the devastation and chaos. The tribunal is being led by Justice William Webb, an Australian appointed by General MacArthur, the Supreme Commander. Most of the other judges have arrived and are staying at the hotel. We are all men of different birthplaces, backgrounds, and I suppose different ideas. Justice McDougall is a trusted friend of the Canadian Prime Minister. Even though Chiang Kai-shek is now fighting the Communist Army, his administration appointed Justice Mai to represent China. Justice Northcroft was a Supreme Court judge in New Zealand. Justice Higgins from the Superior Court in Massachusetts is the American appointment to our tribunal. The French have appointed Justice Bernard, who fought and served as a justice in their African colonies. General Zarianov, who represents the Soviet Union, is a loyal subordinate to Stalin. Lord Patrick, a Scottish justice, was chosen to represent the United Kingdom.
This grand building will be our working space for the duration of the tribunal. Follow me, please. Well, this building once housed the Japanese Military Academy and the War Ministry. Some of the accused would have planned their attacks right here in this room. Now we will use it to decide their fate.
Скажи им, что мы все разделяем большую ответственность.
The general says you all share great responsibility.
As individual judges in our own countries, we decide the fate of others, from divorce to fraud to murder. But the issues we face on this stage are extremely complex, and will require our collective skills and experience. You've all been briefed in advance, and you have all read the charter that governs our duties. However, please indulge me as I take us through a summary of the challenge ahead. It falls upon us to deal with three categories of crime, the most striking of which is crimes against peace, more frequently referred to as crimes of aggression. We are being asked whether or not these leaders conspired to plan and wage aggressive war. We are also being asked to consider crimes against humanity. They include murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other iniquities, including crimes committed by a power on its own citizens. Finally, we have to consider conventional war crimes. That is, ill treatment of prisoners of war and atrocities committed on the battlefield. In other words, crimes that violate the traditional rules of war.
In China, millions of people were killed, most of them civilians.
I sympathize with your countrymen, Justice May, as I do with the soldiers and civilians of all our nations. However, we must be careful as we tread a fine line between justice and revenge.
I wasn't thinking of revenge. I was referring to the fact that the atrocities in China are grave crimes under international law.
With respect to Justice May, aside from courtroom blueprints, Nuremberg clearly provides us with strong legal precedents to uphold.
Oh, there are many differences between events in Europe and those here in the Pacific.
It seems to me the crimes are the same.
The whole world will be following this trial in every argument and decision we make.
All the more reason to uphold the precedents of Nuremberg.
As I was saying, we face an immense challenge. I am confident we will find a way through it. Our courtroom, designed to replicate the one being used to try the Nazis in Nuremberg.
In November 1948, 2.5 years after the trial began, President Webb takes 7 days to read out in court the final judgment of 1,212 pages. On the last day of court, the sentences are presented to each of the accused, a moment dividing them between life or death.